This episode contains descriptions of sexual encounters and murder. It may not be suitable for all listeners. You've ended up on the Scottish moors, and this is where you're going to die. The only use you ever had was to be fucked. I'm GS, and this is Skinwalker. Despite the dead body in front of him, Hall continued to unload shots into Wright's torso and head. All the while, he was angrily screaming about the killing being Wright's fault. He then shot one final time into Wright's already limp body. On that fateful day in 1977, at 53 years of age, Archibald Hall Jr. went from being a lifelong thief and trickster to a murderer. While trying to dig a shallow grave for David Wright's body, Hall found the soil to be impenetrable due to the Scottish cold, so he then opted to cover the body with the foliage, rocks and loose soil available to him in the surrounding area. Covering a corpse in this fashion may sound unlikely to succeed. However, Hall later in prison recounted a story of taking John Wooten to the site in the weeks following. Once there, Hall challenged him to find the body. When Wooten stated he was unable to do so, Hall pointed to a spot mere feet away from them, where the body of David Wright lay undisturbed, and laughed. After burying the body, Hall still had to return to the stately home at Curtleton. Without missing a beat, the audacious Hall even relayed Wright's apologies as to his sudden departure, as he had, quote, taken up a good job in Devon. Lady Hudson was not to know that rather than being in Devon, David Wright's body was decomposing in nature only a matter of miles from her home. Hall was quickly forced to leave Curtleton himself after that. A call had been placed by an anonymous party to Lady Hudson as to Hall's true identity. Keen to avoid any further police attention on his close friend, Wooten spirited Hall away from the area. This meant that Hall had been ultimately unsuccessful in robbing Curtleton House, but he had succeeded in avoiding being caught for the murder of David Wright. The ease with which Archibald Hall ended David Wright's life, however, was a chilling omen of what was to come. Walter Scott Elliot was born on October 9, 1895. He had served with distinction as the Labour MP for Accrington for a single term, ending in the early 1950s, and had worked in trade and civil service for much of his adult life. In 1948, he had married his second wife, a loving woman named Dorothy, and the two lived together at Richmond Court on Sloane Street in London. Retiring in the late 1960s, he began enjoying a quiet life, spending much of his time pursuing his love of collecting antiques. He also spent a great deal of time at his local gentlemen's club and socialising with his wife, Dorothy. The rare antique collector and his doting wife sought the employment of a butler to assist with their needs at Richmond Court. Unfortunately for them, Archibald Hall answered their call. Hall was initially well liked by the family. The lady of the house, Dorothy, allegedly spoke of him as though he were a friend who was lodging, rather than a butler living in service to the family. The more reserved Walter made no such declarations of fidelity, but equally seemed to show no signs of distrust for his new butler. It appeared by this point in his career, Archibald Hall had even acquired some skills in his butlering. At a minimum, he now held enough skills to fool the Scott Elliots as to his capabilities. Hall enjoyed keeping his old talents honed too. Within a matter of weeks, he was already casing local properties looking for an easy break-in. Knowing he would need to be well in sight during any local robberies to avoid arousing his new employer's suspicions, Archibald reached out to Mary Coggle, his old criminal and sexual acquaintance, for advice. She knew just the man. She then hastily introduced the man to Archibald as Michael Kitto. There exist two accounts for the day following this meeting, both of which have never been tested in court nor independently corroborated. Both of these statements were also, at varying points, given by Archibald Hall. At the time nearest to the incident, in the late 1970s, that after meeting Kitto, he had told him to meet at his flat, which adjoined to the Scott Elliott's that evening, late in the night. Once there, they could discuss the best way not only to plan any local robberies, but the inevitable robbery of the Scott Elliott's. Kitto turned up after dark and entered the building at Archibald Hall's entrance, where they drank long into the night. Realising that they were out of alcohol, Hall and Kitto elected to steal some from the Scott Elliott's cellar. The pair were confident, for reasons known only to them, that they would not be disturbed. Dorothy Scott Elliott, however, had heard the noise and appeared to question Archibald as to what they were doing and who her unexpected houseguest was. Before he could answer, Kitto had struck Dorothy, knocking her to the ground and maintaining a grip over her nose and mouth. When he removed his hands, there was a noticeable amount of blood staining her face and the floor. To prevent them being caught, the pair smothered Dorothy with a pillow, hiding her body in a bed until the following morning. Then, in his autobiography in the 1990s, Hall gave a slightly differing account. In this account, he believed Dorothy to be out of the house, so had simply taken Kitto on a tour of the property. When surprised by a returning Dorothy, Kitto leapt on Dorothy and strangled her both manually and with a pillow until her death. Hall watched on, a passive observer. They then moved the body to a bed for storage until they could dispose of it. At this point, both accounts merge. After putting Dorothy's body into the bed overnight, her husband Walter Scott Elliott was drugged by Hall and Kitto to make him easier to control, limit his inquisitiveness, and ensure his compliance. They were then assigned roles to attempt to clear up their mess. Mary Coggle, who had put the pair in contact, was to act as a decoy for the group, wearing Dorothy's clothes and a wig to enable supposed sightings of her, while Hall and Kitto were to dispose of Dorothy's body. Hall ensured he kept Walter Scott Elliott drugged and sedated. Hall informed him, while Walter was in a drug-induced state, that Dorothy had headed north to spend some time with family and she expected him to join her there soon. Before leaving, Hall and Coggle, acting as Walter and Dorothy, began to empty the Scott Elliott's bank accounts with fraudulently signed cheques. Returning to the house, the group then bundled the befuddled man into the back seat of a car, mere inches from his wife's dead body in the boot. The group began to drive north to Scotland. They had a cottage in Newton-ar-Loch, which they used as a base, staying the night. They ensured they kept Walter Scott Elliott sufficiently drugged at all times. The man was so drugged that, according to Hall, he was incapable of rational thought. In the morning, the group hired a car, which they then transferred Dorothy's body into. Again, they sat Walter in the back, close to his sweetheart's lifeless body. Arriving at a suitable destination in Perth, a rugged region in Scotland, 80 kilometres north of Edinburgh, Hall and Kitto disembarked from the car and callously buried Dorothy's body by the side of a road. They then returned to Newton-ar-Loch and celebrated their success. One evening, they left Walter in the car outside of a pub. This nearly proved their undoing, as a local man came in at one point and said that the old man in their vehicle had asked him to hurry up as he wanted to go to bed. Had the local gentleman been more scrupulous, or Walter Scott Elliott less unsuspecting, Archibald Hall would have ended up in jail that night. Instead, he simply finished his drink and headed to his car. Upon their return to their cottage base, the group knew that Walter, then sleeping in the spare room at Newton-ar-Loch, had to be killed. They had forcefully abducted him, and if they withdrew the sedation, he would talk. If he spoke, they would be jailed, and not just for kidnap. They loaded him back into the car and began to drive north from Perthshire, arriving in Glen Affric, a remote area 50 kilometres outside of Inverness. Once there, Walter Scott Elliot asked if he could be let out to relieve himself. Sensing an opportunity, Archibald Hall pulled over. As Walter urinated at the side of the road, Hall and Kitto mercilessly beat him to death with a spade. The pair had initially tried to strangle him. However, despite his dehydration, drug-induced senselessness and old age, Walter Scott Elliot proved to be too fearsome a foe for Hall to dispatch with his own bare hands. The cowardly Kitto allegedly struck the first blow. However, from there it became a frenzied attack. Walter Scott Elliot was effectively discarded by the crew. He was buried haphazardly in an unmarked grave at the site of his murder, aged 82. By this point, Archibald Hall was in a frenzy. He devalued the moral decision to kill and began to see it as an easy solution to complex problems. Kitto was equally dangerous, albeit in a more limited fashion as he ceded control of the group to Hall. Mary Coggle, the crew's newest member, opted to focus only on the benefits to be had from her new companions, rather than the danger being in their company and schemes posed. She had been making calls home to London, boasting to a number of her friends about her newfound riches. She had been speaking long and loud and drinking in equal measure. She had also taken to wearing Dorothy's mink coat, which was supposed to be used only for a few days following the murder to buy Hall time. Hall was displeased. He decided that she too had to go, telling Kitto, who was fond of Mary, he was free to, quote, fuck her, but afterwards kill her. Kitto offered to try and bring Mary around to a more demure way of approaching their newfound riches. She relented when asked. Hall, once told of her change in heart, informed Kitto he could continue with his sexual plans for her, but there was no need for the murder after that. Hall and Kitto left Mary in Newton-Arlosh while they returned to London to remove the remaining valuables from the murdered Scott Elliot's property. While they were away, Mary, in direct contrast to her promise, took once again to wearing Dorothy's expensive coat around the small village, drawing noticeable attention. When the pair returned to Newton-Arlosh, they were somehow informed. Archibald Hall's mind was made up. Mary Coggle was going to die, and she was going to suffer. That evening, Hall waited as Mary had sex with Kitto. She then came into the living room and propositioned Hall. He eagerly accepted. After having sex with Mary on top of Dorothy's mink coat, he beat her with an iron poker, while Kitto held her down. When Mary stopped resisting, Hall tied a plastic bag around her head and left her to asphyxiate. He alleges he sat on the couch as it happened. Having known Mary Coggle for 10 years, he and Kitto executed her in less than 10 minutes. The pair then dressed Mary's body in male clothing, hoping her eventual discovery would make it look like a lesbian love affair gone wrong, and dumped her body in a stream in Dumfriesshire. The pair, cognizant of their growing body count, decided to lay low at John Wotton's home in Cumbria. While en route, they were informed of an unexpected guest at the house, namely Archibald's sibling, Donald. Donald was either, as the court stated, Archibald's blood brother, or as Hall stated, his half-brother, born of an affair his mother had during her first marriage to Archibald Hall Sr. Whatever their fraternal status, Archibald had long suspected Donald of being a paedophile and detested his sibling. Donald's only impropriety, which was proven against underage children, was committed when he was a teenager. However, he was at the time in question just off of serving a 3-year stint in prison for sexual offences. When Wooten informed Hall that he was not interested in having Donald remain at the house, Hall assured him he would take care of it. By this point, for Archibald Hall, this, or indeed any problem in need of solving, meant murder. Hall and Kitto travelled to Cumbria and met up with Donald. He was eager of an opportunity to earn some extra cash, and given his status as an ex-convict, he was willing to do just about anything. Convincing Donald of their intentions to have him join their criminal ranks, they asked him to demonstrate what he could bring to their team. To impress the pair, Donald stated he knew how to tie a man up with only 6 inches of string. Showing Hall how to employ this technique with himself as a willing test dummy, Donald had sealed his own fate. Hog-tied on the floor, in front of an impending Archibald, he asked to be untied, his demonstration over. Donald wriggled frantically on the floor, unable to remove the bonds. He was instead met with a chloroformed pad held to his nose and mouth until he ceased to resist. With Donald fighting against his captors, they elected to pour more of the chloroform directly from the bottle down his throat. Hall and Kitto then drowned his, by then, limp body in the bath. This ultimately proved to be overkill, as a coroner's report deemed Donald to have died of chloroform asphyxiation, the first finding of its kind in Scotland. Archibald Hall and Michael Kitto were, to put it lightly, incredibly dangerous. Just as their murderous flame grew to its most incandescent, fate intervened. With a string of bodies in his wake, Archibald Hall was to be undone by an unassuming man called Mr. White. Mr. White was the proprietor of the Blenheim House Hotel in North Berwick, a small establishment just north of Edinburgh. Hall and Kitto once again headed north of the border in a rental car on body disposal duties. During a break in their drive, the pair had changed the licence plates on their rental car to a random assemblage of numbers and letters to minimise the police's ability to trace the vehicle afterwards. Getting tired, they opted to take a break and stay overnight in Mr. White's hotel. Archibald went to the desk to book the pair a room. Kitto noted later that typically, whenever Hall was booking them in or dealing with rental staff, he held an air of confidence, and this also showed in his actions. He was generally authoritative and assertive throughout, backing up his fictional backstory. However, while dealing with the suspicious Mr. White, Hall began to falter. He murmured strange facts about an upcoming emigration to Australia, and his hand was trembling and he was fumbling through his memory to remember the fictional details the pair had assigned themselves. He eventually submitted the form to secure the room and quickly decanted into the hotel's lounge, whereby he ordered a large drink of brandy. White promptly turned to his wife, searching for her guidance. When she noted that she too felt there to be something sinister at play, White phoned the local police station. Hall, who seemingly recovered from his incident at the check-in desk, was sprawled out nonchalantly in a booth in the lounge when the police arrived to investigate. They were initially questioned concerning the car, as a quick check of the details had revealed the plates to belong to another vehicle entirely. Hall mentioned he had simply been loaned the car. They were removed from the building to answer more questions down at the local station. One of the officers drove Hall's rental vehicle to the station, oblivious to the fact that Donald Hall lay dead in the vehicle's boot. While in the station, Hall asked to use the toilet. When there, he flushed papers down the toilet which showed he was not the character whom he was purporting to be. Given the crime they were being investigated for at that time was not considered high risk, it says nothing as to the quality of the policing that this was allowed to happen. He returned, and a while later asked to use the toilet once more. This time, knowing the fate which was going to befall him if he stayed in custody, Hall climbed out of a window and began to run. He hailed a taxi on the main road and asked the man to simply drive. When they were nearly out of North Berwick, the driver mentioned there was a roadblock up ahead. Archibald Hall knew his time was up. When the officers at the roadblock noticed who sat in the back, they asked him if he would like to tell them anything about a body. A man who alleged he had committed some of the most audacious crimes of the century and was on a murderous rampage was caught for good in the most mundane of ways, having failed to lie convincingly to a hotel manager and bodging a license plate swap. Hall was not enticed by the idea of prison, especially with the length of time he was looking at. Upon his return to the holding cells, Hall elected to take a mixture of barbiturates he had concealed in some fashion during his arrest. The effect was immediate, and arriving, foaming-mouthed Hall was rushed to hospital for life-saving treatment. Michael Kitto, on the other hand, was doing his best to minimise the jail time he would receive. He was singing like the proverbial canary and doing anything to portray himself as the lead, not the leader. The cottage at Newton-ar-Loch, the bodies strewn across Scotland, and the deeply twisted interpersonal relationships of the group, Kitto bared all. Unbelievably, due to the excellent work of the medical team, Hall survived. When he came around, he was confronted with the evidence Kitto had been supplying and realised he was finished. Hall decided to at least get some notoriety and publicity from his capture and offered to assist the police in their investigations. The police were led to all of the bodies, and Hall was cooperative in their investigations. One interesting quirk is that Hall and Kitto required to be tried twice. Despite dumping all of the bodies in Scotland, only one of the murders was committed there. Dumping dead bodies is illegal, but it is somewhat trumped by actually creating dead bodies through murder. Due to jurisdictional considerations, Hall and Kitto were tried in England for all of the crimes save for those concerning Walter Scott Elliot. As Walter Scott Elliot had both been killed and dumped in Scotland, his was the only trial selected for the Scots courts. Hall noted that he believed dumping the bodies in Scotland would lead to him being tried within the Scottish court system. However, the courts elected to follow a different path than that which Hall had envisaged for trial. Hall was sentenced to 15 years for the callous murder and dumping of Walter Scott Elliot in the Scots courts. He was subsequently tried in England for the murders of David Wright, Dorothy Scott Elliot, Mary Coggle and Donald Hall. For this, he received a whole life tariff and was informed he would spend the remainder of his natural life in prison. To serve his sentence, Hall was housed in Hull Prison. During his incarceration, Hall developed a tendency to hunger strike. Whenever his conditions were not to his pleasure, he would refrain from eating food in the hopes that his deterioration would force the prison system's hand. His most drastic hunger strike was in 1977, whereby he dropped nearly 30 kilograms in weight over several months. His rationale was that he wished to serve his sentence in Scotland, to be amongst his own people. Similar incidents marred his record within the prison system throughout his life. However, Hall's life in prison was not merely hardship and anger. During his time, he openly flirted with the press about juicy details to be had which he had never previously disclosed. Paul Pender was, in 1992, working at BBC Scotland as a scriptwriter. He had recently co-produced a show named The Bogeyman, which had received some critical acclaim. At his desk one day at the BBC Scotland HQ, Pender was passed a call. A man with an English accent declared, "You're the man I'm looking for." He then quickly embraced a broad Glaswegian brogue and noted, "You're the man to tell my story." It was at this point that Archibald Hall met Paul Pender. Intrigued, Pender approached Bill Bryden to seek his permission to flesh out the story. Bryden consented, and Pender began regular trips to Phil Sutton Prison, where Hall was housed at the time, to start investigating whether the case would merit a television series. Throughout 8 separate visits, Hall began to work his magic on Pender. Hall would elaborate at length to Pender over his sexual triumphs and conquests, with Pender later describing the language as pornographic and Hall himself as evil. Nonetheless, Pender found him to be a charming man. At Hall's request, he smuggled £20 into the prison for him, disguised inside a cigarette box. Their relationship progressed, and the idea of a show based on his experiences was widely considered within BBC Scotland. However, interest waned and the visits became less frequent. Pender was also beginning to refuse Hall's request. There were no more smuggled £20 notes. Hall quickly turned on Pender. The stories of sensual romance soon became accounts of Pender's impending fate should he not yield to his demands. The death threats which Hall had issued were so fearsome and believable, Pender quickly made his excuses from Glasgow and took up employment across the Atlantic in the United States. Given a whole life tariff and still incarcerated in the 1990s, having been arrested in 1977 at 54 years of age, Hall's death in prison looked somewhat guaranteed. The European law which enshrined the right to know your release date, as discussed in Skinwalker Case 2, the Linwood bank robbery, was not even close to being on the agenda, and Hall was fast becoming an old man. Whole life for Hall looked like it meant whole life. In 1995, Hall campaigned to be euthanised. He felt he had served his time and was being cruelly forced to live as a punishment. Arguing that it would be fairer on him and the taxpayer, he wrote to multiple publications to voice his beliefs. His pleas fell on deaf ears, and it was expressed in some newspaper opinion pieces afterwards that should Hall feel living amongst the criminals of the city was a particularly nasty form of punishment, perhaps he should not have been a criminal of the city alongside them. Archibald Hall eventually passed on September 16, 2002, at the age of 78. He was one of the last prisoners to ever serve a true lifetime detention service within the UK system. Hall's death was not the end of his notoriety. Just as his story had fascinated Paul Pender in the early 1990s, it continues to attract comment from the public and media alike. Opinion pieces appear semi-regularly across all forms of the Scottish press until this day. Everyone from former lawyers such as Alan Nicol in his tremendous exposé of the blurred lines between fact and fiction in Hall's story, given in his book The Monster Butler, TV stars such as Gary Lewis and BBC Alba's Anush Lane, Scots Gaelic for The Perfect Gentleman, and opinion journalists from almost every media institution have attempted to get inside the head of Archibald Hall. Some wish to expose Hall's lies and fabrications, others want to show how evil can hide in plain sight with just a little cunning and manners. Some simply want to generate comment and sell copy, giving the Hollywood-esque tint to the story of Archibald Hall. One thing all share is to be careful to whom you give the key to your door. We would like to thank you for joining us for our first ever 2-part episode on Archibald Hall, the Monster Butler. Picking through this story was not easy, given Hall's writing style, love for fabrication of tales, his delusions of grandeur, and the wanton desire of the media for the fantastical. We're incredibly thankful for Alan Nicol's book, The Monster Butler, Inside the Mind of a Serial Killer, in which the analysis provided when set against Archibald Hall's own The Wicked Mr. Hall, the memoirs of a butler who loved to kill, enabled us to keep a somewhat firmer handle on Hall's own personal storytelling. We would recommend all of our listeners to pick up both books. As always, please like, rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. We have some great things lined up for you listeners in 2020 and we can't wait to share them with you. Have a great new year.
Norway reeling from twin attacks. First, a suspected car bomb.
Quick was known as Sweden's worst serial killer. Quick was convicted.
Kim Wall disappeared after boarding Madsen's submarine in Copenhagen harbour last August.
Terrorism, miscarriages of justice, serial killers, disappearances. From the known to the lesser known, we give you true crime from the dark and frozen regions of Northern Europe. This is Nordic True Crime. Subscribe to our bi-weekly episodes on iTunes, Spotify, or on your podcast provider. And find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Nordic True Crime.